Thank you all very much for being here this morning. I'm Joyce McConnell, the Dean at West Virginia University College of Law. It's a wonderful morning. We're able to have Professor Michael Gerrard with us from the Columbia School of Law Center for Climate Change. And today, our own Professor Patrick McGinley is going to introduce Professor Gerrard to all of you. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Dean McConnell. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Gerrard. You've got some information in the handout this morning. I want to elaborate a little bit about that and make a couple of comments about the topic that he's chosen to address today and topic that he's chosen in departing from a long and distinguished career at the bar. He's really made a significant turn in the direction of his career when he joined the Columbia University School of Law faculty and started the Center for Climate Change Law there. He is a graduate of Columbia University and the NYU School of Law. Until late 2008, he was the managing partner at the New York office of Arnold & Porter and engaged in its environmental practice. He is currently continues to be senior counsel to the firm. He's practiced environmental law since his graduation from NYU in 1978 in New York. He's tried numerous cases and argued many appeals in federal and state courts and administrative tribunals, and handled the environmental aspects of many transactions and development projects. During the 2004-2005 period, he was chair of the American Bar Association's section on environment, energy, and resources, and that section has 10,000 members spread across the United States. He's also chaired the executive committee of the New York City Bar and the environmental law section of the New York State Bar Association. Legal Media Group's Guide to the World's Leading Environmental Lawyers, based on 4,000 questionnaires, reported that Mr. Gerrard received more personal nominations for this guide than any other lawyer in the world. He's been rated by Chambers USA, America's Leading Lawyers for Business, and Who's Who Legal as the leading environmental lawyer in New York, and has been recognized in the Best Lawyers in America 2007 for environmental law, and there are other accolades as well. He received Environment Advocates of New York 2007 Advocate Award. Not only has he been practicing at a high level at Arnold & Porter, he's somehow found the time to write or edit 7 books, 2 of which were named Best Law Book of the Year by the Association of American Publishers, the 12-volume Environmental Law Practice Guide that was published by Matthew Bender back in 1992, and the 4-volume Brownfields Law and Practice, the Cleanup and Redevelopment of Contaminated Land. His most recent book is Global Climate Change and U.S. Law. It was published by the ABA in 2007. In the absence of a case book or course book on climate change, that book has been utilized in law schools around the country as part of the curricular offering. In addition to his domestic practice, Professor Gerrard has advised numerous foreign investors on the environmental aspects of the United States properties. He's handled several cases concerning transboundary and marine pollution, and he's lectured on environmental law around the world in such places as Great Britain, France, China, Canada, and India, as well as throughout the United States. But bringing that experience a little closer to home, in an article recently describing his assumption, his duties at Columbia's new Center for Climate Change Law, I found an article that was titled "The Smell of Inspiration," and it quotes Professor Gerrard. "I once had my nose certified by the West Virginia Air Pollution Control Commission," said Gerrard. They trained people to detect the characteristics of chemicals in the air. If I smelled something terrible, I would call them and they would investigate. We had dinner last night, and the folks who grew up in Charleston there were talking with Professor Gerrard about some old memories. Professor Gerrard's father came to Charleston to teach at what was then Morris Harvey, now the University of Charleston, and so he is at heart and continues to be a mountaineer. And that West Virginia nexus is important. As you can see, the topic that he'll present today, climate change and the future of coal. Nowhere is the debate concerning climate change more real and vibrant than in West Virginia, where jobs and the environment hang in the balance, waiting for the resolution of one of the most important public policy issues, not only of our time, but of all time. And as a lead-in here, there are a couple of quotes I'd like to read. Now, you all know that former Vice President Al Gore led the movement to try to gain broader public recognition of the threat of climate change. He said 2,000 scientists in 100 countries engaged in the most elaborate, well-organized scientific collaboration in the history of humankind. They produced long since consensus that we will face a string of terrible catastrophes unless we act to prepare ourselves and deal with the underlying causes of global warming. That's one vice president's view. Another vice president, Dick Cheney, said, and I quote, "I have not seen Al Gore's movie." There are quotes, and I don't have enough time to read those, but you know, there's a debate. There are those who deny there is climate change, and those who say it is imminent, and we're going to see the collapse of life as we know it. Senator James Imhoff has said, with all of the hysteria, all of the fear, all of the phony science, could it be that man-made global warming is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people? It sure sounds like it. And this is not a partisan political debate, however. Senator John McCain has said we have many advantages in the fight against global warming, but time is not one of them. We stand warned by serious and credible scientists across the world that time is short and the dangers are great. Here at home, Senator Rockefeller has said, "I'm concerned that powerful voices in West Virginia continue to argue that climate change is a myth. I'm not on the same bandwagon that some of you are," he told an audience filled with coal industry representatives. Burying one's head in the sand is not a solution and can only backfire, Senator Rockefeller said. Don Blankenship, the chairman of and CEO of Massey Energy, has said, "The Greeniacs are taking over the world. If Nancy Pelosi thinks that decreasing CO2 in this country is going to save polar bears, she's crazy. If CO2 emissions are going to kill the polar bears, it's going to happen. What we do here in the U.S. is not going to save them." And so, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Michael Gerrard, a prominent lawyer, national bar leader, legal scholar, and last but not least, a man with deep roots in West Virginia who will help us to come to grips with this extraordinary dilemma.
Thank you very much, Dean McConnell, Professor McGinley, for an extraordinarily warm welcome. I don't get back home to West Virginia nearly as often as I would like to. I graduated from George Washington High School and spent my summers in college working for the Charleston Gazette. But I am not here as often as I would like, and when Dean McConnell invited me to give this talk, I jumped at the chance. It's really a great honor to be here. I'd like to start by just running through some charts and graphs to put this all in context. This chart shows the global temperature records going back to 1880. And as it shows, although there is a lot of variation from year to year, it jumps up and down, there is an unmistakable upward trend over the past more than a century. This chart shows the temperature anomaly, which is how the temperatures vary from what a standard had been. And first, in the upper left, the 1970s, then the 80s, then the 90s, and the 2000s. Redder is hotter. As it shows, there are a few parts of the world which have become cooler. But overwhelmingly, most parts of the world have become warmer, some of them much warmer. The past summer was especially warm. These are the countries that experienced new record high temperatures during the summer of 2010. In Russia, the temperatures were higher than they had ever been, and we saw hundreds of wildfires whose smoke killed as many as 15,000 people in Moscow. The fires destroyed about 1/4 of the grain crop of Russia and caused Russia to eliminate its grain exports, which caused food shortages in some other parts of the world. In Pakistan, there were the heaviest monsoon rains on record, leaving some 14 million people homeless. In China, there were the worst floods in decades, leading to thousands of deaths. Now, it's always perilous to tie a particular weather event to climate change because there is a lot of natural variability. But one thing is clear is these sorts of things that we experienced are the same sorts of things that are projected by the climate scientists as these trends that I've talked about continue. At the same time, we've seen steady increase in sea levels. The Arctic ice sheet is shrinking. Again, it varies from year to year, but there's an unmistakable downward trend. Drought conditions have also increased here. Red is more, blue is less, and in many parts of the world, particularly in parts of Africa, there are much more severe drought conditions than in recorded history. Another effect of CO2 emissions unrelated to temperature is ocean acidification. And we've seen in the past decades an increasing acidification of the ocean as the CO2 reacts chemically, and that has negative effects on marine ecosystems. In looking at CO2 levels, this chart traces the 800,000-year record of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. This is derived largely from ice cores, from analyzing the bubbles in ice cores. And as it shows, we are now at a level of CO2 that is far higher than has been experienced in the last 800,000 years. And under the more optimistic scenarios for what it will be like in the year 2100, we're up here. And under more pessimistic scenarios, we're all the way up here. Systematic actual observation data began around 1958 on top of Mount Mauna Loa, Hawaii. And as it shows, there's been a steady upward climb. There is an annual variability due to the summer-winter cycle, but every year the level of CO2 in the atmosphere goes up. It's not only CO2 that's going up. This going back to about the year 0 shows that methane and nitrous oxide, two other significant greenhouse gases, have been going up at a steep rate over the last century. CO2 and temperature have been closely correlated. Again, although there is up and down variation, as you see, it tracks reasonably well. The temperatures track reasonably well the CO2 data. A number of people have said that this may all be happening, but it's not as a result of human activity, and some have pointed to solar activity. But the fact is, as this chart shows, that solar activity in the last several decades has been more on a downward trend, and whereas temperatures continue to increase. So solar activity can't be the explanation for that. In fact, when you consider solar activity and volcanoes and all of the other natural forces that clearly have an effect on climate change. They can't account for what's going on. What this shows is a number of models that account for all these natural activities but no human activities. This, and what the predicted temperatures would be. This is what the actual temperatures have been. But when you plug greenhouse gases into the equation, then the models and the actual temperatures correlate quite closely. There's simply no other explanation for what has been happening to global temperatures. So where are these greenhouse gases coming from, these greenhouse gases that are having a significant effect on the environment? Well, the largest single source of them is coal. In the United States, this is an inventory from the U.S. Energy Information Administration showing the major sources of greenhouse gases in the United States. And far and away, the largest is CO2 emissions from the stationary combustion of coal. The second is mobile sources like automobiles and trucks. Third is stationary combustion of gas, and then oil. And as a result of all of this, much of the environmental community of the United States has put fighting coal combustion very high on its agenda. They're doing so in the legislative and the administrative and the judicial arenas. My Center for Climate Change Law tracks all the climate litigation happening in the United States. We have identified 340 different judicial and administrative proceedings in the U.S. concerning greenhouse gases and climate change. And until recently, the largest category among them was cases about coal. In the last few months, there's been an explosion of litigation brought by industry fighting greenhouse gas regulation. But there's a lot of this activity. In the legislative arena, for the last several years, the favored way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions was a cap-and-trade system. Cap-and-trade was introduced into U.S. environmental policy under President Reagan to help phase out lead in gasoline and to help phase out ozone-depleting substances. It then became a centerpiece of the first President Bush's program to reduce acid rain, and it was embodied in the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, which were passed by a strong bipartisan majority in both houses of the Congress in 1990. It's designed as a way to let market forces find the least expensive way to reduce the pollution that it's trying to address. In the last presidential election, both major party candidates, both Senator McCain and Senator Obama, favored a cap-and-trade system. Cap-and-trade was the basis for the Waxman-Markey bill that was passed by the House in June of 2009. And that bill would have allowed for a very large quantity of free allowances and offsets that would have moderated the price impact and would have caused only a modest increase in electricity prices in the next several decades. Cap-and-trade does provide that flexibility. But in recent months, cap-and-trade has become a dirty word, and I'm aware that in the last few weeks, certain leading officials have even literally shot at it. So cap-and-trade and all other climate legislation died in the Senate, and the likely result of tomorrow's election is that it will stay dead for at least 2 years and possibly a lot longer. But the administration still believes that climate change is a serious threat. So in the absence of congressional action, which they certainly would have favored, they're using the tools they have under existing law. That's chiefly the Clean Air Act, which is now 40 years old. Everyone agrees that the Clean Air Act was not written with climate change in mind and that it's far from the ideal mechanism to deal with climate change. But in 2007, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the landmark case of Massachusetts versus EPA, clearly held that EPA does have the power under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases, and so that's what they're setting out to do. The Supreme Court told EPA that it had to decide whether greenhouse gases endanger public health and welfare. EPA decided that they do. Having made this finding, EPA is now compelled by the Clean Air Act to go ahead and regulate greenhouse gases. EPA therefore issued what's called the Tailoring Rule, which is a rule that means that only large sources of greenhouse gases will need permits. Smaller ones will not. But EPA has no interest in regulating small sources of greenhouse gases, and the environmental community is fine with that. But many in industry are opposed to this piece of deregulation because they want the regulatory program to be so painful that EPA or Congress or the courts will squash it. EPA has also tightened the fuel economy standards for cars and light trucks. The auto industry is fine with that, but again, many in other industries are opposing it because it triggers other Clean Air Act requirements. So some industries in some states have filed a total of more than 90 lawsuits, as you can see reflected in this pie chart, in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in an effort to stop these regulations. Many states and environmental groups and some industries are weighing in on the other side. No argument dates have been set. Meanwhile, EPA is moving forward with picking the technology standards that will apply to major emitting sources under these new rules. There also are a lot of other regulatory activities that affect the coal industry and greenhouse gases specifically. Some of them are just about disclosure. In January of 2009, the greenhouse gas reporting rule took effect that is going to require many entities, more than 10,000 entities around the country, to disclose their greenhouse gases to EPA, and those reports are going to be filed with EPA and made public next year. The Securities and Exchange Commission issued guidance requiring that the securities filings of publicly owned companies have to disclose the effect of climate regulation and climate change itself on companies. The Council on the Environmental Quality issued guidance under the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the federal statute that requires federal agencies to prepare environmental impact statements for major actions that could affect the environment. Aside from those that explicitly regulate greenhouse gases, there are also a lot of new regulations that are forthcoming that will regulate conventional air pollutants, but will also have a significant effect on coal. EPA is proposing what's called the Clean Air Transport Rule, regulating sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, and a hazardous air pollutant rule regulating mercury and acid gases. And these together will require the installation of very expensive equipment in coal-fired power plants and some other industries. These rules are not being imposed as a matter of just bureaucratic make-work. EPA estimates that the rules will together save annually at least 16,000 lives and possibly as many as 40,000 lives annually. These rules may well lead to the retirement of a significant number of coal plants, especially the older and less efficient ones. Much of the fleet of coal-burning power plants in the U.S. is old. A lot of them that are still operating were built in the 50s and the 60s, and so these regulations of conventional air pollutants may be enough to tip some of them into retirement. And there are battles going on over other regulations of the coal industry, wholly apart from air pollution. There are forthcoming regulations on cooling water discharges because steam-fired power plants, whether it's coal or nuclear or whatever the source, release a lot of hot water into streams, which has adverse environmental impacts on the fish and other aquatic life, so that's going to be regulated more closely. EPA is considering the regulation of coal ash, particularly in view of the disastrous Kingston, Tennessee spill from last year. The restricted use of coal in the U.S. as a result of the restrictions on coal-fired power plants is partly counteracted by the increasing demand abroad for U.S. coal. In 2008, the last year for which I found statistics. 17% of West Virginia coal was exported out of the U.S. The countries that bought the most in order were India, France, Brazil, Egypt, and the U.K. In recent years, there have been quite a number of purchases of coal assets in West Virginia, and so the amount that is exported is going to considerably increase in the coming years. Some of these countries do, and many of these countries do not have significant restrictions on air pollution from their power plants. Also affecting coal mining, but not combustion of coal, obviously, as everyone is aware, there's been ferocious litigation and regulatory and other activity about mountaintop removal. Also a lot of additional attention paid to health and safety regulation, especially in view of the Upper Big Branch disaster. So there is a great deal of environmental regulation that is going to pose tremendous difficulties for coal. But my own view is that the greatest threat to coal is not environmental regulation. It's natural gas. Recent discoveries over the last few years advancing the technology of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling and discoveries of large deposits have greatly increased the supply and reduced the price of natural gas. Earlier this year, the MIT released an important study called The Future of Natural Gas with projections on what that's going to look like. The Marcellus Shale is the first of the formations to be utilized in a massive fashion like this. A lot of that, as you all know, is happening here in West Virginia. But there are a number of other formations that are around the country. And so these projections show that in the last few years, there's been a steep upslope of the production of gas from these sources. But in the coming years, it's going to become much, much larger. It's really an enormous resource. The same report looked at what they projected the fuel mix for electricity generation to be in the coming years. And this is what they anticipate, given anticipated natural gas prices and environmental regulation, but no climate legislation. And so under that scenario, coal declines significantly. Natural gas greatly increases in the time between now and 2050. If you throw climate regulation into the mix, this is what MIT projected. That without significant subsidies, coal largely drops out by 2035, and gas takes this enormous piece of the energy mix. This is actually similar to what really happened a generation ago in the UK. Abundant supplies of natural gas were found under the North Sea. That combined with deregulation and labor policies of the Margaret Thatcher government and some developments in generation technologies led to what has been called the dash for gas, which was the rapid conversion of much of the UK power sector from coal to gas. And so this is what happened in the UK, that beginning around 1990, the amount of coal that was used for electricity production greatly declined, and gas moved in. In the U.S. today, there is an overcapacity of natural gas-fired power plants. There was an excess construction of them in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and so a lot of them are already there, ready to go to burn gas, and more will be built. They cost less to build than coal plants for the most part, and so we're going to see a considerable amount of displacement of coal by gas. This soaring abundance of and low price of natural gas is bad news not only for coal, but also for nuclear and for some renewables. It's having major effects on the entire energy industry that are only now beginning to be understood. The growth of natural gas production from shale gas has been accompanied by a lot of complaints about shoddy operations and negative environmental impacts by some, but by no means all, operators of these operations. And it's giving the good operators a bad name. We don't have a uniform and vigorous system for regulating this activity. If the environmental impacts of the extraction of coal are going to be tightly regulated, the same should go for the environmental impacts of the extraction of natural gas. So in view of all of this, what are the best hopes for the future of the coal industry? Well, clearly carbon capture and sequestration is a very important part of the future of the coal industry if it's to operate in an environmentally sound and regulated fashion. It is still not in commercial operation, but progress is being made. AEP has an important demonstration project at its Mountaineer plant in Mason County. Between 2002 and 2008, $2.3 billion in federal subsidies were directed at CCS. $3.4 billion in stimulus funds were directed in that direction, as well as a considerable amount of private money. The Kerry-Lieberman climate bill, which crashed and burned in the Senate, would have provided $2 billion in annual support for CCS. In the absence of climate legislation and in the absence of renewal of stimulus legislation, it's not clear where the massive funding is going to come from to pay for the necessary R&D to bring CCS up to the level where it needs to be. It still faces a lot of uncertainties. Its cost, it's the energy penalty, the parasitic energy demand, although there are technology advances to help that, the availability and sort of geologic integrity of the storage sites, the ability to retrofit existing coal-fired power plants with this new technology, and most importantly, the ability to scale up, the ability to build enough of these to really make a significant dent. But it does, CCS does seem to offer the best prospect for continued use of coal in a carbon constrained world. And several studies have shown that in order to make it economically viable, it's important to have a price on carbon, whether through a carbon tax or cap and trade or through some other mechanism. So CCS development is an important long-term strategy. What is not a viable long-term strategy is denial that climate change is a real problem. A year ago, the basic outlines of the science on climate change seemed settled. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the international body that assembles the work of scientists all around the world, had released a series of very important reports, and they had won the Nobel Peace Prize. U.S. government scientists working under President Bush reaffirmed the findings of the IPCC. A number of the national science academies of the U.S. and 12 other countries came out with a statement supporting these scientific findings. Several U.S. Scientific associations issued a statement in October of 2009 reaffirming that there are multiple independent lines of evidence affirming anthropogenic climate change, and contrary assertions are inconsistent with an objective assessment of the vast body of peer-reviewed science. So all of these U.S. scientific societies joined in with that statement. There was one trial that took place where expert witnesses were called and on the issue of climate science, and the U.S. District Court in Vermont concluded that global warming is taking place as a result of human emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and its consequences are likely to be harmful, is widely accepted in the scientific community. A study last year from the University of Illinois found that among scientists who specialize in climate science, 97.4% agreed that human activity is significantly contributing to global warming. It concluded, quote, "The debate on the authenticity of global warming and the role played by human activity is largely non-existent among those who understand the nuances and scientific basis of long-term climate processes." The challenge, however, appears to be how to effectively communicate this fact to policymakers and to a public that continues to mistakenly perceive debate among scientists, close quote. But over the past year, there's been an astonishingly successful campaign of public relations and disinformation to discredit all of this science. We may be falling behind in the manufacture of solar panels and wind turbines, but we're world leaders in the manufacture of artificial doubt about climate science. The IPCC document, most recent assessment report, had 3,000 pages. 2 paragraphs in technical appendices to those were found to be in error. And based on 2 paragraphs that had nothing to do with the overall conclusions, people have tried to say that the whole IPCC enterprise is discredited. Several thousand emails were stolen by persons unknown from a server in England, and a few messages were cherry-picked and then mischaracterized as ClimateGate. 4 independent inquiries have exonerated the scientists who were involved in that. What has not happened is the formulation of any comprehensive alternative explanation for all of the global phenomena that have been observed with respect to global climate change, global warming, and ocean acidification. But a political movement has arisen in the United States that believes all of this, and it seems likely that in tomorrow's election, that movement will put several of its adherents in high office. In view of all this, the world is looking at the U.S. with a combination of scorn, resentment, and glee. Scorn, because these skeptical beliefs are so outside of the realm of known science. Resentment, because the U.S. is historically the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and this is seen as a way of running away from our responsibilities. And glee, because this rejection of climate regulation in the U.S. is causing us to fall far behind in the global movement toward alternative energy sources. But U.S. inaction is an excuse for the rest of the world to move slowly on climate regulation. Last year's UN climate conference in Copenhagen, which was planned with very high hopes of achieving a global agreement, was a severe disappointment, largely because of the recalcitrance of the U.S. and of China. There has been some thought in the U.S. that our inaction is a way to spur action in China, the country that has now overtaken the U.S. in terms of its annual greenhouse gas emissions. But for the past decade that this policy has tried, it has completely failed, and in fact has been counterproductive. It's given China a strong argument in international discussions why it should not have to act, and there's no reason to believe that that will change. Meanwhile, China is soaring ahead of us in many technologies. China will do what is in the best interest of China. Many of China's cities are choked with air pollution, much of it from the combustion of coal, and that's leading to domestic pressure to change their energy mix. Many of China's coastlines are very vulnerable to sea level rise, and that will lead to domestic pressure to take precautions. China also wants energy security as much as we do, and it's unhappy that it needs to import so much oil, gas, and coal from other countries. So for its own reasons, China wants to limit its energy use and its air pollution. But of course, China also wants to continue the economic growth that has been so successful in pulling millions of its people out of deep poverty. But both the U.S. and China have refused to bind themselves to international agreements restricting their emissions, and I expect that will probably continue. International agreements are notoriously unenforceable, but there is one especially notable exception, the World Trade Organization rules, which allow countries to take unilateral action. The climate bill that the House passed last year provided that if other countries are found to be less stringent than the U.S. in controlling their greenhouse gas emissions, the U.S. can impose border tax adjustments, tariffs really, on goods from those countries. My colleagues at Columbia Law School who specialize in international trade law tell me that they think that this provision is sound and would probably survive a challenge in the WTO. But without climate legislation, the U.S. is unable to impose such sanctions against China and India in other rapidly developing countries if they don't take serious measures to control greenhouse gas emissions. I wish I could conclude this talk by saying that the future of the coal industry is bright in the face of climate change and abundant natural gas. It's frankly not, in my view. There are pathways for economic success in West Virginia, and people in this university and elsewhere have done great work in laying them out. But denying the reality of climate change is not a pathway to economic success for this state. Thank you. I'd now be happy to respond to questions.
Paul Brown, Professor Emeritus of Physiology. I'd be interested in your comments on any legislative progress toward tax and dividend.
In the climate world, especially?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that nothing's going to happen for at least 2 years. It's clear that we're likely to have a House of Representatives controlled by the Republicans, and the Republican leadership has made it very clear that they don't want any kind of greenhouse gas regulation. The Senate may not flip, but will have several climate skeptics. So I don't think that for the next 2 years we'll have any climate legislation at all, and then it'll all be a question of what happens in the election 2 years from now.
Hi, thank you for your excellent presentation. Ann LaFaso, Labor Law Professor here at WVU. Quick question and then slightly longer. Your data, does that come from the MIT study Future of Coal in 2007? Is that where?
No, it comes from the Future of Natural Gas study released by MIT in 2010.
2010, okay.
Right. Yes, more recent than that. I'm familiar with that other study, which mostly talked about carbon sequestration technology.
Right, okay, so Future of Natural Gas in
Yes.
2010?
Yes.
Okay. And then does natural gas have the way, I don't know how it's extracted or how we know that coal mining is potentially a dangerous profession. Do you know anything about the potential dangers for workers in capturing the natural gas?
My sense is that the occupational dangers in natural gas extraction are modest. That it's you have a lot of truck traffic, and so people driving the related trucks have the same hazards that any other truck driver does. The bigger environmental issues that are concerned with natural gas extraction concern some of the hydrofracking fluids and whether they contaminate groundwater water supplies. And so that's a source of considerable controversy. But I think most people think that that is a problem that is solvable, that sound engineering practice and rigorous enforcement to make sure sound practice is followed will greatly minimize that kind of danger.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kurt Doiron, and what I wanted to know is, we only really know about the negative effects of coal mining after decades and decades of use. And if we're going to continue to go on to using natural gas, we kind of largely don't really know about what kind of effects natural gas drilling has yet. It's a relatively new process, this hydrofracking process, and a lot of the concerns really haven't been addressed because the scientific research hasn't really been done. And what my question is why doesn't America, being the leader of the world, look for more renewable and less polluting technologies to implement rather than look for another natural resource extraction?
Well, I think we're doing both. I mean, you're certainly right that there remain a lot of uncertainties in the environmental impacts of natural gas extraction. And it is so lucrative, it is such an attractive method in so many ways that there's some risk that the development is getting ahead of the science. But so we need more regulation there than we have. But clearly, the climate legislation that is dead for at least 2 years contained many incentives for the development of renewable energy. There's a lot. The private sector is devoting a lot of attention to renewable energy and to energy efficiency, which is actually even likely to be a more productive source of greenhouse gas reductions. The real risk is that natural gas is becoming so cheap that it's going to squeeze out renewables as well as coal and nuclear. And so there is a real real danger of that. One way to address that is through renewable portfolio standards, the requirement that electric utilities obtain at least a certain percentage of their power from renewable sources. About 20 of the states have their own standards. There was a bipartisan bill that would have had a federal standard, although it was a very low standard. It wouldn't have accomplished much, but it would have headed us in that direction. So a number of important regulatory steps need to be to further provide incentives for the growth of renewable energy and energy efficiency.
Do you see any of those standards actually being implemented before we see much larger adverse effects from natural gas drilling like we have seen with coal burning?
It is possible that there will be some such legislation in the next 2 years, but I think the more important, at the federal level, I think the more important activity there will be at the states. There are quite a few states that agree with the overwhelming scientific consensus that climate change is a problem and needs to be addressed, and that also see the development of renewable industries as a cornerstone of their own economic development. So at the state level, I think we're going to see much of the most important activity over the next couple of years. That's not to say that I think that will have the effect of suppressing the amount of natural gas development. I think the economics of natural gas development are so compelling, at least in the short term, that that will continue to grow at a considerable rate.
Thank you.
Hi, Little Tyler here. Thanks for the talk. My question is about the EPA's regulation of greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. How is that being proposed to be structured in terms of, are they going to be putting a cap on greenhouse gas emissions, or are they going to be preventing large emitters from being, basically, I mean, would they be creating a cap and trade system without actually creating a market system to trade carbon?
That's not the current plan. The current plan is to impose technology standards, that once the rules take effect in early 2011, entities will need permits, starting with the very largest of the emitters, will need a permit in order to be emitting greenhouse gases together with other material. EPA is developing what's called best available control technology guidance, and will also be coming up with new source performance standards. And all of those will be technology standards that these facilities will have to operate. And they will probably also call for a considerable amount of energy efficiency. There are some legal theories under which a particular provision of the Clean Air Act, Section 111D of the Clean Air Act, could empower EPA to impose a cap and trade system on greenhouse gases, but EPA is not currently heading in that direction. It's more on the technology standard side.
And do you see with the, if we were to have a climate bill that put a price on carbon, would that also incentivize a greater use of natural gas, given that it has a lower carbon intensity per unit of energy than coal does?
Absolutely. Natural gas generates about half the greenhouse gases per unit of electricity produced as coal. And so a price on carbon, whether through cap and trade or through a carbon tax or any other mechanism, would incentivize conversion from coal to gas.
Okay. Thanks, and the last one, under the Clean Air Transport Rule, which I believe is the same as the Clean Air Interstate Rule, as it might have been previously.
It succeeded it.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Will that also, how will that impact, so you were talking about nitrous oxide emissions. I'm just unsure of the chemical releases of natural gas with nitrous oxide. So that's also probably going to be a push toward more natural gas as well.
Well, the Clean Air Transport Rule, which was released by EPA as a substitute for the Clean Air Interstate Rule, which was struck down by the D.C. Circuit, is not aimed explicitly at greenhouse gases. It's aimed at conventional pollutants, and the principal effect it has on greenhouse gases is to accelerate the retirement of some plants. It is possible that it will have an effect on some natural gas operations, and it's becoming clear that one of the environmental impacts of natural gas production and utilization that has not received nearly as much attention as it should is fugitive emissions of methane that some of the gas gets out. Methane is a more powerful greenhouse gas per ton than carbon dioxide. And so I expect that over the next few years we'll see a lot more attention paid to trying to capture those fugitive emissions.
And have you seen any research that combines the carbon and nitrous emissions from natural gas generation and then adding the methane to that? I mean, how does that, have you seen any research that compares that to the total life cycle coal emissions?
I haven't. That's a very good question. I believe that that kind of research is underway, and it certainly is appropriate. It should be done.
Okay. Thank you.
You'd mentioned that the... Go ahead.
You're going to see a lot of students get up because they have a mandatory meeting.
Okay.
Do you mind if I announce that?
Sure.
I'm sorry to interrupt the question and answer, but I understand that the first-year students have a mandatory meeting at noon, and I want to give you the opportunity to get up en masse, and then we'll continue with any questions.
No, you warned me.
I didn't realize so many first-year students would come.
Right.
It's great. Okay, we'll go ahead and continue with questions now. Thank you.
You had suggested EPA's rule is proposing technology-based standards for coal-fired facilities. Union of Concerned Scientists came out a couple of years ago with a report called Gambling on Coal, which, among other things, suggested that the issue of who pays for those retrofits and pollution controls could become very important. The last couple of decades, the assumption has been that the ratepayers must pay the full cost of any pollution control equipment, but there's some expectation that, in fact, the stockholders of these utilities may need to share some of that cost and the risk. Is there any likelihood that some market discipline will be established on stockholders and utilities, or are the ratepayers going to be on the hook?
Well, that's a very good question. And, of course, the question of who pays is decided not by the EPA, but by the state public utility regulators for the most part. And the utility companies are clearly going to go to their regulators and say this is a mandatory requirement, and therefore it should be something that we should pass through. I think that for the most part they will probably have the winning side of that, but one of the areas that has received much too little attention in the overall area of climate regulation is the central role of the state public utility commissions in deciding how electric utilities spend their money and who pays for it. And I think that in the next few years we'll see much more of a focus on that and an effort by the commissions to impose some greater discipline on the utilities to take a look at at the future trends in regulation in addition to short-term impacts.
Hi, thank you for being with us. I wanted to talk a little bit about the state of the debate, and you well characterized the situation where a couple of years ago we seem to be moving in the direction of a general consensus that climate change is an issue, that human activity is creating a fair amount of it, et cetera, and to be arguing about policy proposals. And now we've kind of moved to a situation where for a lot of people, the preliminary question that was once thought to be settled is now thought to be in play. This has to be a great source of frustration to people like yourself. And so I'm wondering two things. First of all, what insight can you give us into how this has happened? I mean, obviously a lot of money has been spent by people with self-interest in blocking climate change regulation, but that happens everywhere. There must be something more than that going on to explain how it can be that a question regarded as settled by scientists is regarded as law by other people. Second question is, obviously sort of, the list of societies and the overwhelming scientific evidence has not seemed to make all that much difference in the public relations battle. So what can folks who believe in climate change be doing to try to sort of counter, other than continuing to sort of point to the same data, which appears not to be working?
Well, I think that you certainly highlight the source of it, that an enormous amount of money has gone into false information, into advertising, into campaign contributions. I think the Citizens United decision from the Supreme Court will probably make that worse. It has shown itself to be a fabulously successful tactic. And it's very disheartening that it has been so successful. So I think that those of us who continue to believe in the science need to use every available opportunity to stand up and whenever someone takes a contrary view, explain that the science just doesn't support that. I think that it's going to require a lot of work and a lot of difficult conversations by a lot of people to try to get that through. Was it A.J. Liebling who said it's hard to convince a man of something if his paycheck depends on not believing it? So we certainly see that. It's in the economic interest of a lot of people and a lot of companies not to believe in climate change, and they will persist in that belief until either so many folks who have looked at the science stand up and give their views, or I fear we have more disasters such as we've had before. For a time after Hurricane Katrina, there was a growth of climate change concern, but that went away. Last summer we had the things I was talking about, but they're Russia, they're Pakistan, they're China. The history of environmental regulation in the U.S. is legislation tends to follow catastrophe. So we had the Oil Pollution Act following from the Exxon Valdez. We had the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act follow from Bhopal. Other incidents of that sort. The difficulty is that at least in those cases there was no dispute about the source of the problem, and here there continue to be people who will dispute it. But I do fear we need more climate-related disasters before more people will wake up.
I guess my question is, why is there not more public debate from people who are, like you, who are making what I think is a very articulate and persuasive argument, and also relaying the science to a lay audience? I feel like there's not that much of that going on, but there's a lot of people, for instance, a Senate candidate in this state who recently said that climate change is a myth, repeatedly and proudly asserted that, and nobody challenged it. So I guess at Columbia, do you guys stage debates between a scientist and a proud demagogue on one hand? Or like, how do you address that?
Yeah, I've engaged in a couple of formal debates against the Federalist Society on this issue. I think that these kinds of debates are very important, and the next time you're in a room where somebody says that climate change is a myth, I hope you will stand up and say it's not so.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a candidate for Senate, or a candidate for the state, or for the U.S. Senator, actually.
Right.
Yet. And also, if I may add,
but you're hopefully a voter.
I am,
and that makes you a very powerful person. Exert your franchise in however many ways you can.
Okay. I was going to ask very briefly, what's the strongest counter argument to the existence of climate change, other than this sort of piffle that comes out in politics a lot?
So is
there a sound scientific challenge?
So what's the best non-piffle argument?
Correct.
I suppose is that there have been times in geologic history where CO2 levels were high and temperatures were high, and obviously human activity had nothing to do with that. The counter-argument to that, of course, is that those were all caused by known conditions, whether it's volcanoes or solar activity or the way that the Earth's axis changes. And never in known history, and I'm not talking about just recorded history, but going back millions of years, has there been a period where temperatures and CO2 levels have escalated at anything approaching the slope, the upward slope that they now have, and that it really takes natural forces over a very long period of time to yield those kinds of changes, and it's purely because of humanity that we've seen the changes that have occurred over the past several decades.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking. I have a question about carbon markets. Do you have any sense of the possibility of an existing carbon market, such as the one in the EU, expanding to create a supply-side market in the U.S. by allowing U.S.-produced offsets to be sold in their market? And a little more specifically, would there be a possibility of Appalachia qualifying as a biodiverse, endangered region for reforestation carbon credits?
Good question. So first, the carbon markets have largely crashed over the last year or so with the failure of the Copenhagen Accord. The Chicago Climate Exchange announced just a couple of weeks ago it's going to stop trading. We still do have the vigorous European trading system, as you say. It would require the European community to want to open up their market to U.S. offsets. And I don't know that politically they want to do that. I mean, it is theoretically possible, but I'm not sure that there's any movement in that direction. And in terms of designating Appalachia as a biodiverse area for carbon credits, I mean, of course, one of the few areas where progress was actually made in Copenhagen was on RED, on the reduction of emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, and that is aimed at supplying credits. But one of the important difficulties with that is establishing additionality, establishing that if it weren't for these credits, these forests would likely be destroyed. And so that demonstration can be made in places like Indonesia and Brazil and Myanmar. It's much harder to make that here. If the world were to get in the position of paying large sums of money to any country that had, or any region that had a lot of forests, you'd see Siberia, and you'd see lots of other places raising their hand very quickly for those kinds of funds, and I'm not sure that that the scarce resources that are available for climate change control are going to go in that direction.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. My question is about, you said that the coal industry it's not a viable long-term strategy to kind of inject this false debate about climate science. It's obviously been effective as a short-term strategy because we've spent a lot of time talking about it. Right. At what point do you think at what point does that hit a wall as far as the long-term strategy? I mean, at what point does the coal industry or larger carbon industry finally hit a wall and it doesn't work anymore? Because obviously the legislative front is pretty grim. Do you think it'll be the EPA regulations that will succeed in doing that? That's my first question. And my second question is, what is the form and extent of coal subsidies right now, as far as how are they paid and how much do they pay as well? Thanks.
Well, on the first question of when will it hit a wall, I wish I knew. It's largely a function of public opinion and political opinion, and we've seen the public opinion fluctuate almost as wildly as the annual temperature variations. 2 years ago, we elected a president who was absolutely in favor of cap-and-trade legislation, and we seem to be heading in that direction. Just 2 years later, that has changed. In the next 2 years, will enough people look at the science? Will enough climate disasters have happened? Will enough industries become unhappy with the inefficient, costly method of EPA regulation to turn it around? I'm not a mass psychologist or a political scientist, and I can't really tell you the answer to that. Coal is actually subsidized less than many other energy sources. There isn't as much of a history of overt coal subsidies. There's a long history of sort of ignoring the externalities of coal, which is an effective subsidy. Professor McGinley is actually probably the world's leading expert on that question, and I don't know if you want to add to that. But
Just briefly, our conversation, at dinner last night, we were talking about the externalities of coal, and one that I mentioned, I asked those around the dinner table to reflect on gas at the cost of black lung in terms of dollar cost over the last 35 years. And I think the range went from 100 million to billion, maybe somewhere in a couple of billion. Well, the cost went over $40 billion. That's the dollar value. Of course, that doesn't include other non-quantifiable costs, like the impact on families losing the breadwinner, having someone disabled, and so forth. And there are many ways that the cost of coal are externalized, not internalized into the cost. And those are costs. And so it's not so much subsidies, government subsidies, it's the lack of enforcement of law, the lack of regulation that forces that particular industry to internalize the cost. That I think is the important question.
for any of those who are listening on the webcast and couldn't hear those remarks, primarily a matter of failure to internalize some of the external costs, most notably black lung, which is an enormous adverse effect for over a period of many, many years.
The Energy Information Agency of the United States Department of Energy puts out a forecast for 2020, 2025, and now 2035 with regard to where our electricity will be, how our electricity will be generated. Their forecast, the most recent forecast, which came out, I believe, 2 months ago, is completely at odds with the MIT forecast with regard to the future of coal. Their forecast is that, if I recall correctly, that in 2025, approximately 50% of our electricity in the United States will still be generated by coal, and in 2035, I don't recall the exact number, but it's close to 50%. Would you comment on the difference or the discrepancy between their study or their reports and the MIT report that was just released?
Sure. The annual energy outlook that is released by the Energy Information Administration is very scrupulous in its description of the assumptions that underlie their projections when they go into the reference case. And for the reference case, they are not assuming any greenhouse gas regulation. They're not assuming a good deal of the other environmental regulations that are coming forward, and I think that their projections about natural gas are modest. I mean, you're quite right that there is a stark discrepancy between the EIA projections and the MIT projections, and you need to drill into the assumptions in both to come to your own conclusions.
I know it's getting late, and thank you so much for coming. I have just a strategic political question, which is that seems to me increasingly that in this country sort of demagoguery holds sway over intelligence. And I was looking around the room, and I would suspect that 99% of us are on your side. And when I go to these talks, it always seems that in the audience, 99% of the people are on the side of the speaker. So my political question is, since this seems to be true of both sides, how do we make these points, or how do you make this point to the people who are not here and who don't want to hear you speak and who don't want to listen and who were wheeling listening to Sarah Palin yesterday? So my question is, you know, it increasingly seems that we all speak to the already converted. And how do you speak to the other side?
Well, that's an excellent question. And, you know, each side has its own channel. You know, if you're on one side, you watch Fox, and if you're on the other side, you look at MSNBC. And I think it's important, for instance, that, you know, institutions like this would invite people with diverse views so you could hear it. I was invited to the Federalist Society, and I was not faced with a lot of nodding heads. But I think that kind of dialogue and sort of finding the lion's den where they'll let you in is a very important part of the dialogue for both sides.
I guess my question is, how do you get more of the lion's to invite you
And last year I spoke to the West Virginia Chamber of Commerce, which had a certain number of lions in the room. But I wish I had the solution to that. But I think that the demonization of each side by the other does not head us in the right direction.
I'd like to ask a question about the carbon or coal sequestration and the liability for that issue. To me, that seems like a really big issue. It seems like we're giving a lot of subsidies to that, and maybe not so much in the future. But we're talking about billions, and we've had this limitation of liability on offshore drilling. We've had limitation on liability on nuclear energy. What do you think is going to happen in that? And is it something that is not risky?
Well, it's not something where we can say with confidence today that it's not risky. This kind of large-scale sequestration has not happened yet. There are geologists who will say with confidence that there are particular formations that will hold the gas underground for a very long time based on geology. I think there is no federal law on the liability for sequestration. This is mostly happening at the state level. Some states are developing their own rules. Montana, I believe, is further ahead than many others, but I have not seen a motion in the direction of a uniform national liability standard. It's sort of state by state, and the state legislatures will make their own assessments about whether to afford liability protections. But clearly, as carbon sequestration technology advances and moves into into more widespread application, that's going to be a very important issue. The liability regime is going to be a very important issue that the states are going to have to confront. It is yet unresolved.
I guess one of my thoughts is, if you can put it down there, why couldn't somebody intentionally, poke a hole? And in terms of, terrorism, and to have the emission of sudden emissions of large amounts of carbon. Is that something anyone's thinking about, or is that just
I don't know that you get
paranoia from terrorism?
Yeah, it's probably more paranoid. My own view is that if I were a terrorist, that would trying to release
It'd be too expensive.
Release the CO2 would not be the way to get a lot of attention in a very short period of time.
Okay, thank you.
There are some I think there was a James Bond movie which had that kind of theme to it, though.
Thank you for coming. With Massachusetts v. EPA and with this district court decision, it seems that our courts are maybe getting ahead of our legislatures in terms of recognizing this issue and dealing with it, or at least saying that it's something that we as a nation need to confront. What strategies or what issues are you seeing coming to your center that you're keeping track of that seem to be the most promising avenues for litigation in terms of recognizing public health hazards posed by global warming and forcing governments, or state and the federal government to take action?
Well, now that the administration is moving forward with regulation, I think that a lot of the litigation activity will be on the defensive side to try to defend EPA's regulations. The U.S. Supreme Court will shortly be deciding whether to accept certiorari in Connecticut versus American Electric Power, which is a public nuisance case brought by several states against several power companies seeking an injunction to reduce their emissions. I'm not sure how far that's going to go. I think that over the next few years, a great deal of the litigation activity by climate activists will be in fighting projects that are high greenhouse gas emission, and so coal-fired power plants, coal mines that yield, that lead to this. There's going to be continued controversy over the Canadian tar sands, which are a whole other thing that's happening. I think that's where a lot of the attention is going to be. But you're quite right that those courts that have looked at the merits of climate change have, so far as I'm aware, in the United States, uniformly said that it is a real problem. Very few decisions have actually reached that point. They're mostly on procedural issues, but those that have, so far as I know, uniformly come out on that side.
We'll have time for one more question, and then we'll have to break.
I was very interested in your comment on public opinion, and I want to relate that to the Chevron doctrine. The Chevron case is the most cited case in history. I think 10,000 cites already, which gives great deference to agencies. And the swings that are possible as public opinion swings and the White House swings. Do you, there are those who feel that Chevron is